Hello and welcome to the Top Hearthstone Cards of the Week. I'm your host, Norbish Gorbanzo, and this is the show where we look at the r/custom Hearthstone top cards. And first up, we have Felvis Ghastly, a 4-mana 2/7 legendary neutral, announces the type and rarity of drawn cards. Oh yeah, baby. The effect would be very trolly, actually announcing, I believe, announcing the new word here, the new phrase used, would talk about actually like voice acting out these lines. So they'd say like, I don't know, was it Sugar Mama? They'd have to announce what like rare rogue. I'm assuming the type means whether it's neutral or like a, whatever hero card it is. Something this reminds me of is the new card Glimmerroot. That's it's kind of gimmicky, you have to choose one of the 3 cards in your opponent's deck. But having a card that has your opponent's and your cards be announced, I think it's fine. It's not overpowered. I will say, it could be argued that the skill of knowing what rarity cards and if it's the certain type and what your opponent is likely playing. Let's say you're playing a pirate warrior and they draw a legendary neutral. You can probably guess it's going to be Patches. So there's going to be fringe examples where this card might actually give you a decent prediction of what your opponent's going to be playing. With that said, if you're actually playing this card, your opponent probably won't be able to guess what's in your deck when your cards are announced. It's a great idea. Of course, I don't think it would really see play, but I think it's a great meme card, and let's make it happen. Alright, next up we have a 5-mana 7/8 Panda epic warrior card, Monk Sensei. Can't attack, and enraged it can attack. Enrage is no longer a deck of its own. It's no longer an archetype. There used to be a OTK with the Raging Worgen. Control decks use Gromish, and Grim Patron could be used with some enrage cards in order to get a massive board. So all of these things and having enrage worked well back then. Unfortunately now, I don't think Enrage holds a spot in necessarily an aggro deck. But where this card comes in is I think Enrage could actually come in as a mid-range or a control deck, because the kinds of cards that are used in warrior enraged decks also inflict damage to the opponent. Cards like Blood Warriors could work well. Sudden Genesis was just added to the game. Sleeping with the Fishes. I think this card could really help make a control-y enraged deck kind of a big minion that doesn't necessarily have to attack, but I think this card could synergize and then make way for other cards to possibly finish the game and overall just make a strong enraged control deck. The cards they're releasing for enraged and damaged minions is almost suggestive of a more control or value, and all of a sudden getting a bunch of value onto the board. Next up we have Land Colossus, 10 mana, 9/12 neutral epic. Taunt occupies 3 spaces on the battlefield. We have a little picture here on the bottom as well. Oh, very cute. So just stat-wise, this card is very similar to Ultra Sword, the 10 mana 7/14. This, on the other hand, is only a 9/12, but of course it also has Taunt. The idea behind this card is it's definitely more control, but it's supposed to punish players that need a lot of minions on the board and punish opponents that, have to get through this Taunt. So it's a very situational card. It can help if you're, getting close to losing in a game. Another kind of cool thing would be that Meteor, if you used it on this card, would only kill this card. It wouldn't actually kill any adjacent cards because they wouldn't be there. I think the design of this card and the occupying spaces thing is fine. In fact, I made a card similar to that. Video is here. I warn you, it's an odd video, but eventually I get to that card. And while I do like the fact that, yes, there's a drawback for certain archetypes that just wouldn't run this in their deck, I don't think this card's the right type of card. This seems too reactive and too expensive in order for it to work. You don't really see Soggoth or Giant Mastodon played much. Like maybe Priests get them off free from Amber, but honestly, the high cost taunts aren't that worth it. And while it's definitely better than Giant Mastodon, and the 2 extra spaces probably don't matter when it comes to, having late game cards like that, I don't think it's really worth it. So I like the idea of cards taking up more than 1 space, but I don't think this is the right card for the job. Next up we have Useless Inventor, a 2-mana 2/3 with Battlecry. Add a completely useless spell that does nothing into your hand. And I must say that the title of this post is Die Counter Spell. So the idea of this card is you get a completely useless spell. In the comments, the creator explained that this useless spell was a 0-cost spell that did absolutely nothing. So while this card is of course great for counterspell, The card also works with any miracle decks, usually Miracle Rogue. I know personally I have trouble getting the Mage quest to actually work, so this card, while it is useless, it does give you a spell that gets you closer to completing the quest. But back to the main reason the creator of this card made this, and it is to counter the counter spell. So personally, I'm all for secrets being kind of powerful. One, because they're secret, they add some skill to the game, so people have to have knowledge of what the popular secrets are and just what all the secrets are in order to test them. Now, the reason counterspell is so powerful is that most spells are pretty useful. Just to demonstrate my point, if you look at the card Raven Idol, most people would just pick a spell off of Raven Idol and almost never a minion. Of course, there are cards like Raven Idol that are really low cost, and usually if you're trying to play around counterspell, you use that or the coin to try to activate the counterspell, and then you continue on with your play. Even with the Discover mechanic, I found myself discovering just some cheap spell because I think my opponent has counterspell, then using that so that they take that bait, and then I can use the spells that I want to use. I'm not necessarily a fan of just including cards like crabs to counter certain things like murlocs or pirates that we found annoying at the time, but I think having cards that are dynamic and help solve around issues are better than just, directly destroying a pirate with a crab, because I think it has multiple uses with Miracle Rogue and Quest Mage, even if that's not really a thing right now. I think this card is really well made, even if it gives you a completely useless spell. Also, I think it would just be funny, like people that are new to the game that get this card and they play it, and they realize they just get a spell that does absolutely nothing. I think that would be hilarious. And last up, we have a 0 mana Warlock card, Curse of the Tongues. Spend all of your mana, enemy spells cost that much more next turn. This card works in the same way as Forbidden Ritual, where you spend all of your mana and you do something with that. Where I find this card kind of distinguishes itself is that you actually don't really have to spend all of your mana during a turn in order to get, a good amount of its value. Because this card just adds the cost to enemy minion spells, depending on how expensive your opponent's spells are, they could average around 2 mana if they're like a Miracle Rogue, or they could average around like 6 mana if they're like a Freeze Mage. Let's say you have a pretty large board, you're going up against Mage, and next turn is turn 6, so you don't want it to get Blizzard. You can play a couple minions, and then with just like 1 or 2 mana left, you can just use this card and ensure that they can't Blizzard. It requires knowledge of other people's spells or what they might play, what you don't want them to play in the next turn. Last card, I just talked about how spells are so powerful that even giving a worthless one is still good so that you can use your powerful ones. I can only think of Lotheb and Millhouse Manastorm's the other way, but I can only think of Lotheb that really, hinders your opponent in their spells. The problem with that card, it's a 5 mana 5/5. It's like, okay, I don't really want to do that much. And usually 5 cost is plenty for your opponent not to be able to play any cards. With this card, it takes the same mechanic, but it also requires the user to actually know what spells your opponent might want to play next turn, and then spend your mana accordingly. This actually could happen, but this may see play in like an aggro deck. If you have a large board, your opponent's coming up on a big board clear. A lot of AoEs, almost all AoEs, are spell-based, so this card is definitely a good option for that. I almost think because the enemy spells cost more next turn mechanic isn't really shown in Hearthstone that often, I'm thinking to myself, this card can't be overpowered. But while the idea is to, of course, block AoEs, playing in an aggro deck with this card could be a little tricky. Still, with that said, I think it's one of the best design cards I've seen in the 6 weeks I've been doing this. Well, that will be all for the top Hearthstone cards of the week. Feel free to discuss the cards down below, cards you liked, cards you didn't like, any overpowered instances or uses for the cards. Thank you for joining me, and until next time.